This is my second of the 4 lectures that I want to offer for this kind of overview of the UFO or UAP phenomenon. And I'm going to be talking about the reality, or let us say the evidence for the reality of crash retrievals of UFOs or UAP. So that's on the agenda for today. And by the way, tomorrow I will be kind of staying on that theme, but looking at it in another way and trying to get a sense of the program behind the scenes, mostly corporate, that is engaged in creating that technology. That really hasn't information, but we have some, and I do want to discuss that. But for today, I want to go over the basic case of UFO crash retrievals. So got a couple of simple screens here. I put this lecture together last week. So some of the visuals are not there. You can see I've got a pretty straightforward title page there, but that's what we're going to be talking about, the retrieval of technology and biologics. And I just want to start out by reminding those of us who may have forgotten that for the first, let's say 30 years, 3 decades after Roswell, crash retrievals were not part of any significant conversation in the UFO community or in the public realm, really, in any way. It just wasn't something that was considered viable. The Roswell event happened. There was the great newspaper headline of the Roswell Daily Record. Everyone in the world has seen that. And then it was debunked the following day. It was denied, actually, within hours. But then the next day, the newspapers came out and said, no, weather balloon. And that was the end of that. Now, a couple of years later, there was a book that was published by a man named Frank Scully. And yes, I think on the X-Files, Dana Scully's character, I think that was an homage to Frank Scully, pretty sure. But Frank Scully wrote a book in 1950 called Behind the Flying Saucers. And that was actually, he wrote that even before Donald Keyhoe, who's very well known, wrote his first book. Scully wrote the first full-length book published in the United States, as far as I know, on UFOs. And actually, it's kind of an interesting book. Scully was a pretty good writer. But what he did here was he discussed what later became known as the Aztec UFO crash. That was of the spring of 1948. I'll talk a little bit about that. I don't have, but he writes this book, and it almost immediately gets utterly panned and debunked. This is not a story that I'm really prepared to go into today with you, but I will say the author of that article, named Bob Considine, was someone who really had it in for Frank Scully. And in fact, some very good work on this was done in the Aztec crash by Scott and Susie, wonderful human beings, which they are, but excellent researchers on Aztec. And you could look up their book. It's absolutely worth reading. They get into the evidence on Aztec. They get into the whole motivations behind the scene to debunk Aztec. But for our purposes here today, it's just worth noting that, after Roswell was put to bed, essentially, and after Scully's book was thoroughly trashed and debunked in the media in the early 1950s, no one was talking about crash retrievals of UFOs. It was considered so far out, so beyond the pale. Like, serious UFO researchers would never consider this. It was ridiculous, particularly in the late 50s and the early 60s. But the reality was, behind the scenes, there were serious researchers who were still occasionally getting information that led in this direction, that maybe the U.S. military did acquire some alien hardware. So it never really fully went away. But it was also one of these things, and we see this culturally all the time throughout decades. There are certain matters that people are just afraid to talk about. They're afraid of the ridicule. They're afraid of the social stigma. And in the UFO community, crash retrievals occupied that place, as did also abductions for a long time. I'm going to talk a little bit about abductions in the fourth lecture, so I'll come back to that. So anyway, that's what happened with crash retrievals. They kind of went away, and it was not part of the conversation whatsoever. And then we get this man here, Leonard Stringfield, who is definitely, look, if I have if there's a UFO researcher idol that I personally have, it might be this man right here. Leonard Stringfield, to me, is just absolutely amazing. He was a fantastically meticulous and clear writer. That book that I have indicated on the top, UFO Crash Retrievals, that is a collection of all of Stringfield's, what he called his UFO status updates. So his status reports 1 through 7, which went from the late 70s, you see there, to 1994 when he died. It's the 8.5 by 11 book. It's very big. And it's, I think, over 400 pages. It's, if you want some good, deep, late night reading on the UFO subject, you could probably not do better than that book. I think it's great. But however, in 1977, what Stringfield published was the book that I have indicated on the bottom here, called Situation Red, the UFO Siege, he called it. And just a real quick thing about Stringfield, he was an active UFO researcher in the 1950s. He had fought in the Second World War. He'd had a Foo Fighter encounter during the Second World War over in the Pacific, as a matter of fact, which he wrote about. And quite interesting, incidentally. An object, this is after the fighting had stopped, after the bombs had dropped over Japan, but there was still U.S. military activity. And he was flying, I think, out of Iwo Jima. And he said there was this bright teardrop-shaped flaming thing that came next to their plane that caused the aircraft to sputter. The engine was failing, and they were preparing to bail out of the aircraft when the object moved away from them, and they regained all the engine capabilities of the aircraft, and they were okay. So a close call there for Stringfield. But I think that triggered his interest. Through the 50s, he was quite active. Then I think became a little less active during a lot of the 1960s, but kind of rejuvenated. And in the 70s, he gets back into it, and he writes this book. And in this book, he spends a little bit of space, maybe less than 20 pages, on the rumors of UFO crash retrievals. So we have to go all the way to the late 1970s before this subject is raised. This is before people were even talking to Jesse Marcel of Roswell's crash. Stringfield, he talked a little bit about a crash that occurred in Kingman, Arizona in 1953. That was due to the research of Ray Fowler, who's still with us, by the way, and amazing man. But Stringfield writes about this, and then he gave a lecture. He lived in Cincinnati, so not far from Dayton, Ohio. That's U.S. Air Force headquarters. And he gave a lecture as an ex-military guy himself, but he's also into the UFO subject, and he has people attending this lecture. And at the end of it, a military man comes up to him, retired, I think, and comes up to him and says, "I've got a story for you." And this began Stringfield's journey to acquire firsthand accounts of UFO crash retrievals, and which pretty soon morphed into or included stories of acquisition of dead alien bodies. And so through the late 70s, through the 1980s, and until his passing in 1994, Leonard Stringfield collected well over 100 of these accounts, and they are fascinating reading. Again, I recommend it. I'll come back to Stringfield in a moment. The other book that I just want to bring to your attention, this is a book that was just sent to me by Ryan Wood, a good friend of mine and a colleague. Ryan, this is the second and will be the expanded edition of his absolute classic work on crash retrievals called Magic Eyes Only. It is almost available for sale. I think it will be out very soon. And what Ryan did in this book is just remarkable. This book had been out of print for way too long, so I'm really happy that it will be back out. But he goes over, at least in the first edition, he had about 75 potential cases of UFO crash retrieval. The expanded edition has a little bit more. I've read this book very carefully, I have to say. So in the first edition of the book, he had his own scale of how reliable are these cases? Can we be confident about the fact that they really happened or not. And in the first edition, he had about 17 of the 75 cases that he rated as above average that they actually happened. In my reading of these cases, I think he was a little bit too tough on a number of them in there. It's my opinion. You can buy your copy of the book and decide for yourself. But it's interesting because when you hear, in the last year, we've heard claims of as many as a dozen instances of UAP crash retrievals, if you've been listening to the conversation in the last year. And to some people, they thought, well, my goodness, that's a lot of crash retrievals. But it's really not if you go over the deep research into this matter. You look at a book like Ryan's or the work of Leonard Stringfield's, and you start to think and realize that there's actually quite a few really credible cases that are in there. This is, I put this together a few days ago. I was just thinking to myself, what are the cases that to me resonate as very probably happening as the result of exotic technology? It's one or two of these where even I'm not 100% sure if it's exotic tech. You can look at the Kecksburg case of 1965. There are arguments that what happened there is in Pennsylvania might not have been an alien craft, and we can certainly acknowledge that possibility. On the other hand, even with Kecksburg, there are some very interesting cloak and dagger machinations that went on behind the scene in the retrieval of that object, and it did indeed seem very exotic to the few people who are able to come, who later came out and discussed it. So I think we should include that as a potential retrieval of ET tech, whether we know that or not for sure. The Italian incident from 1933 is one of these things where it took me personally a long time before I began to give that case some credit, but I think that we really must give it some credit. This is due to the research of the excellent Roberto Pinotti of Italy, who really has looked into this case in great detail, has pulled up documents from the Mussolini era that do very much seem to speak to a retrieval of something highly exotic in northern Italy at that time. In Cape Girardeau, I'll come back to that in just a moment, so I'll just leave that. Roswell, I'll leave that. Aztec is a case that deserves its own full lecture and has received that many times. But suffice to say, this is March of 1948, very close to the Four Corners area out in the Southwest. And in my view, I have strongly come to the opinion that Aztec was a legit UFO retrieval. It's important to say that, in my view, because the fact is that even when I was relatively new in the UFO field, a little over 20 years ago, it was still very common for the experienced high-level UFO researchers of that time. Stanton Friedman was still not fully had come around to the reality of Aztec. He did after that, I believe, but it took a lot of people a long time. And I think a lot of that was the remnant of the vicious trashing of the case that had taken place decades earlier. I really do think that a lot of researchers were just kind of gun shy of Aztec. But thank goodness for Scott and Suzanne Ramsey and some good researchers before them as well, who looked into the Aztec case to kind of resuscitate it. An event in Del Rio, Texas in 1950. I really won't be able to get into the details of most of these. Kingman, Arizona, I think a very strong case. Las Vegas, 1962, was covered in a very fine book by the researcher Kevin Randall. He did a book on UFO crash retrievals and talked about this case, and I think made a very strong argument that an object zoomed across the United States at ultra high speed from the east going toward the west, triggered the attempted intercept of multiple Air Force bases during its travel, did a temporary landing, lifted up, and then crashed not far from Las Vegas in 1962. It's a fascinating case. And he actually made a very good argument that in the Project Blue Book records and the Air Force records on this, that they were very intentionally, deceptively labeled as two separate events. It's fascinating. The Berwyn Mountains are in the United Kingdom, out in Wales, and in 1974, it does really seem as though a very exotic object came down. Nick Redfern, I know, did a really good bit of analysis on this in one of his books. Bolivia, 1978, I'll just point out, this is something in which we have United States documentation indicating that something exotic and unusual went down in the mountains of Bolivia at that time. And that, I'm talking about the language of the US documents that we have, brought in a UFO connection to that. US personnel went to Bolivia to take control of that operation. We don't have a whole lot of information about it. We've got some declassified documents that came out, shortly after that, and that's it. We have nothing else. McGuire Air Force Base. Oh, looks like I have a typo there. Is that a crash retrieval? Well, yeah, I think it is. It does appear that McGuire, this is in New Jersey. This is the event in which a U.S. Army military policeman apparently shot dead an alien being. It's an incredible story. The main person who has really talked a lot about this is U.S. Air Force retired Major George Filer, a man that I think is just a legend in our field. Great guy. I still publishes Filer's files every week or every other week, by the way. So wonderful. But George was assigned to McGuire Air Force Base in 1978. Has a lot to say about this. And by the way, he's not the only data point that we have on the McGuire Air Force Base incident. I've written about this at length in my second volume of UFOs and the National Security State. Dalnogorsk, of course, is in Russia, the Soviet Union, back in 1986. A heck of a case. And I'll just mention, just offhand, here in the Rochester area, Tracy and I ran into a gentleman who served in the Soviet military back during that period of time. And each of us in talking were shocked about the other. I was shocked that he was at Dalnogorsk in 1986. He was shocked that I'd ever heard of the name of the city. It's like, you know about Dalnogorsk? I was like, yes, I do. And we had a very interesting conversation about this. He was not present at the retrieval of the object there, but he said, I was there. And he said, I know exactly the area you're talking about. That whole area was cleared. The forest in that region was cleared. It had just recently been cleared. And obviously something important went on there, but he wasn't part of the inside operation to retrieve that technology. But that does appear. That's a fascinating case. And it looks like one of certainly more than one Russian retrievals of UAP technology. So it is important to remind ourselves that the United States is not the only game in town when it comes to these things. So let me talk a little bit about just a couple of these. I will talk about Cape Girardeau. It is a fascinating case. It's not as strong in terms of witness testimony as, say, Roswell is. Roswell, we have many, many people talking about this. Cape Girardeau, we really have one person, and that is Charlotte Mann. I happen to know Charlotte Mann, and I've spoken with her on a number of occasions, as have other researchers. I must say she is an absolutely wonderful person. You can't help but really like Charlotte. There's no question about her honesty. And in fact, there's one video that's out there somewhere. I don't have my copy of it here, but where she's with her sister talking to an interviewer about this event. But Charlotte's really the main person here. So she's been, Leonard Stringfield, pardon me, was the first person to interview her, but others also spoke to Charlotte. Her story is that her grandfather was a man named William Huffman, who was a reverend minister, and he received a phone call that by local authorities to come and to pray over victims of some kind of crash. And by the way, Charlotte got this story from her grandmother before she died. So her grandmother knew this story from her husband, and tells it now to her granddaughter, Charlotte. This is how the whole thing came about. Anyway, you had police, FBI, emergency crew were there. We have stories that there was a strange craft with hieroglyphic-like writings. Sounds familiar. This is a drawing or two drawings that you see that apparently there was a photograph that existed that described the kind of scene you see on the top right. We've seen this type of photograph out there. It's out on the web, different web searches in different versions. Are any of them true? Is really the question. I suspect, you know, the old expression, where there's smoke, there's fire. I think that we have enough smoke in this that there is probably some fire. But I mean, having said all of that, this is not the strongest case you're going to find. Nevertheless, there's enough here that when I look at it, I will just say to you, I think this probably happened. And if it did happen, you know, let's just think a little bit about this. We have claims, for example, that a lot of our advanced technology came from UFO crashes, and many people have pointed to the invention of the transistor, which is 1947. That's the year of Roswell. And I mean, it just seems like it's too short a period of time to credit the invention of the transistor to Roswell. I mean, they're happening at the same time. Doesn't make sense. There was a good study, however, by Dr. Bob Wood, who looked into this matter and did, I think, do a really nice job at connecting some of the technology that went into the transistor, not to Roswell, but to Cape Girardeau. He actually even traced out the places where the transistor was developed logistically, fairly close to Cape Girardeau in some cases, and looking at the timelines and so forth. And I mean, is it possible? Yes, I think it's absolutely possible. Will we ever really know for sure? You're talking about corporate secrecy here. And I mean, it's not difficult, frankly, to see how something like that could just be brushed aside and hidden in the story of how this thing was invented. I mean, it doesn't seem like a difficult thing from my point of view. So anyway, that's Cape Girardeau. Let's go to Roswell. I want to do a little bit of something that, you know, 10, 15 years ago, we used to do more often, and we almost never, no one ever talks about Roswell anymore. Not in as like what happened, what actually happened. Back in the 90s, Roswell was all the rage. Everyone was talking about Roswell. In the build up to the 1997 50th anniversary, my goodness, the whole UFO community was talking about it. I was still totally unknown, but I was deep in the research of UFOs, and I was following this as well. But I think, you know, in the last decade, certainly, we don't really talk much about Roswell. It's kind of done. We're kind of Roswelled out. But look, this is an important case. And I just want to go over a little bit of the timeline just to remind you of how amazing this case actually is and was. So it starts with this man here, Mac Brazel. That's a picture of him. He was a sheep herder. He was a foreman of a ranch called the Foster Ranch, owned by a family named Fosters. And he's out there on July 5th, Saturday, and he finds crash debris. As I indicate here on this slide, there's metal and there's beams that are plastic-like. And I say plastic-like because you couldn't bend or break these things. We all know the story. Very lightweight material all around. Imagine how bizarre this must have seemed, particularly in 1947. You're out on your horse, you see all this stuff on the ground, and you're like, what is this? He said it was string-like material, not string. Foil. We all heard about the foil. You crumple it up and it comes right back to its original, formula, its original way it was. Very lightweight, very strong. And he's like, wow, this is interesting. And he takes some of it and shows his neighbors. They're named the Proctors. They're like, wow, that's pretty cool. What are you going to do with it? I don't know. And he eventually calls the sheriff of Roswell, that man on the left named George Wilcox, calls him. He brings actually some of it to Wilcox's office very next day on Sunday. Wilcox is like, oh, wow, okay, looks like we got to deal with some kind of crash, dead people. So he sends 2 deputies out there. They never make it. And, we have to keep in mind, this is a big area. So we say Roswell, but in fact, the crash occurred 75 miles north of Roswell Army Airfield. It's out in the desert. I went out there one time way back in 2006 to the actual crash site, or what we think was, and there's just nothing out there. And in 1947, it was worse.